artificial brains, we may be able to increase the level of intelligence behavior in the robots that these artificial brains control. So asteroid-sized Artilects need not be limited to architectures that generate human-level intelligence. Artilects could not only think faster with hugely more components, but in qualitatively superior ways as well. Their huge surface areas would allow them to attach huge numbers of external sensors to themselves, including use of the full range of electromagnetic wavelengths from gamma rays to radio waves. They could communicate with other asteroid Artilects across the asteroid belt and deeper into space. Such asteroid-sized Artilects using nanotech-based principles are probably the logical extreme of human technological imagination, unless we can create something called femtotech, which I will discuss a bit later. Before asteroid-sized Artilects are built, earlier versions will certainly be much smaller, more on a human scale. But even at this smaller scale, when talking about 1 bit per atom, we will still have many technological problems to solve in order to build such computers. Nanotechnology, that is, molecular scale engineering. This brings me to the need for nanotech, as distinct from femtotech, which I mentioned just above. Nanotech is an abbreviated form of nanometer scale technology, that is, molecular scale technology. Nanotech builds things at the scale of a nanometer, which is 1/1000th of a meter, about the size of molecules. Femtotech is an abbreviated form of femtometer scale technology. A femtometer is a quadrillionth of a meter, that is 1,000th of a trillionth of a meter, which is about the scale of a proton or neutron inside the nucleus of an atom. Femtotech would be nuclear or even quark scale engineering. Quarks are elementary particles which combine to form protons, neutrons, and other such particles. The first people to think about the possibility of building things at the nanometer level were presenting their ideas in the 1950s. In the 1990s, these ideas have become well accepted, and regular monthly progress was being made in this domain. The essential idea is that atoms can be placed into exact position to build molecular scale machines, that, for example, tiny molecular scale robots that pick up atoms and position them to build molecular scale structures. When one begins to imagine the kinds of things that could be done with molecular scale machines, the field begins to sound truly science fiction-like, yet the possibilities exist. Many scientists believe that given the current rate of research progress in the field of nanotech, it will probably be well established by about the year 2020. This is about the same time that it will be possible to store 1 bit of information on a single atom, according to Moore's law. Ad-libbing here. Remember, I wrote this book in 1998, so the year 2020 was 2 decades away, but as I speak at the moment, I'm saying this in 2017, so 2020 is just around the corner. Back to the book. Consider some of the more fantastic things we could do with a fully fledged nanotech. Imagine tiny robots sent into the bloodstream of human beings, which are programmed to detect cancer cells. They would travel throughout the body, detect the cancerous cells, kill them, and then self-destruct or be flushed out over time. A similar story could hold for immortality-generating robots, which could repair aged cells and restore them to a state like those of young children. With a regular dose of such fountain of youth robots, people could become immortal. Each of the cells in our bodies contains a DNA program that explicitly or implicitly causes the cell containing it to die. This DNA program takes the form of a molecular structure that can be reprogrammed by a molecular scale robot, a nano device. Hence, nanotech offers humanity the prospect of immortality. If that happens, we will need a new politics to decide who lives forever, who dies, and who reproduces. Another favourite nanotech idea is to have one's head or one's whole body frozen soon after death, on the assumption that in a century or so it will be technologically possible to restore the damage to the dead brain and make it come alive again. Nanomachines, the theory goes, would be able to enter the dead tissues and repair them. There are already hundreds of people who have paid for their bodies or heads to be frozen for an indefinite period. They establish a monetary fund whose interest pays the cost of the apparatus and materials to keep the body frozen. Molecular-scale robots, nanoscale robots, or nanots, could build copies of themselves. They could reproduce, and hence grow exponentially in numbers, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, etc. After 20 such doublings, the numbers are into the millions. If ways could be found to make these nanots cooperate to build human-scale products, then conventional economics would be revolutionized. It would cost almost nothing to make huge numbers of nanots, which then build the product. The price of the product would then be merely the cost of the raw materials. Goods could become amazingly cheap, effectively costing nothing. The cost of designing the first such self-reproducing nanot, capable of cooperating with others of its kind to build specific products, would be amortized over the many purchases of the same nanot design all over the planet, and hence would cost almost nothing. The whole concept of economic scarcity would need to be reconsidered. Economics as a specialty would be revolutionized. Construction materials could be made many times stronger, because today's materials still contain cracks, faults, etc., that weaken their strengths. Nanotech could assemble these materials with atomic precision, with no faults, no cracks, no blemishes, and hence they would be much stronger. This would probably mean that we could construct buildings that would be kilometers high if we wanted to build them. The structural skeletons of the buildings would be strong enough to withstand the stresses and strains generated by strong winds. Diamond-like materials could be built with amazing strength. As I see it, there are at least two major paradigms conceivable when discussing how nanotech could build human-scale products. One is to imagine zillions of self-reproducing nanots that, once reproduced, would combine to build the product. How would such a mammoth task be coordinated? One would need to think of the manufacturing process like a molecular-scale city with a huge infrastructure to make it all happen. But one could imagine nanots each doing their tiny thing on conveyor belts, assembling their few atoms at this point, at that point, and passing on the result further down the line, where other nanots do something different. It would be Henry Ford at the nanoscale. With zillions of nanots doing the same thing simultaneously, in parallel as computer people say, it would be conceivable to imagine a human-scale device being built. Molecular modules could be built from atoms, and these modules used as components to build larger macro-modules, which in turn become components of macro-macro modules, etc., until a human-scale product is built. To make such a construction system work, the enormous molecular infrastructure needed may or may not prove to be very practical. Artificial embryology. Personally, I prefer a nanotechnology based on the method nature has used for billions of years to build its life forms, that is, an embryological approach. In the embryological approach, one starts with a fertilized egg that divides and divides until some cells, depending upon their position in the embryo, begin to differentiate. Their intercellular environment sends them chemical signals that are used to switch on and switch off certain portions of their DNA, which in turn results in different proteins being built, which perform different tasks. These different proteins then change the nature of the differentiating cells. Eventually, the mass of differentiating cells creates a living, three-dimensional biological creature. Evolution has created a growth mechanism that takes a linear, one-dimensional coded string of chemical instructions, usually called DNA, and translates it into a three-dimensional functioning living creature. The study of how this miracle of nanoscale engineering occurs is called embryology, or development. The machines that instruct the differentiating cells how to switch on and switch off genes at the appropriate time in the growth process are of molecular scale. A biological cell can be viewed as a molecular scale city with millions of molecular inhabitants all organized into one functioning whole. I would like to see the creation of a new branch of science that I call artificial embryology. It would aim to mimic the same process that nature employs to grow dinosaurs, or gnats, G-N-A-T-S, gnats, from single fertilized eggs. Scientists and engineers would need to understand how nature does it in far greater detail than is known at the beginning of the century. That's the beginning of the 21st century. But as the molecular biologists are discovering all there is to know, more or less, about certain single-cell bacteria, many of these scientists are changing specialties towards studying how multicellular creatures are built. Embryology is now a hot research topic, so we can expect a steady flow of discoveries in this domain over the coming decades. Eventually, I expect to see the creation of what I call embryofacture. That's embryological manufacture. That is, using artificial embryological techniques to manufacture human-scale products from the nanoscale. Instead of needing a complex nanoscale infrastructure using nanots, as described earlier, one would need a complex timing control system which decides when particular genes in the DNA, or its humanly designed equivalent, switch on and off when stimulated by certain molecular signals in their inter- and intracellular environment. Designing such a complex control system top-down from scratch will probably be beyond the abilities of human scientists, so a more likely approach will be to use an evolutionary engineering approach. The mapping between an artificial DNA sequence of molecular-based growth instructions and the final 3D product, whether living or not, is probably impossible to predict due to its complexity. So probably the only method remaining is the one nature uses to learn how to embryofacture its creatures, namely evolution. Evolutionary engineering. An evolutionary engineering approach to embryofacture might work in the following way. But one begins with a zillion random molecular artificial DNA strings, which translate themselves into blob-like 3D molecular structures. Pre-designed molecular scale nanots then move in and measure how closely the actual blob resembles the shape or function of the micro-product that is desired. Those blobs that get a higher score will see their corresponding artificial DNAs survive and have more copies, that is children, made of them in the next generation. The less functional blobs are killed off, Darwinian style, thus generating a kind of survival of the fittest strategy. The child DNAs are then mutated slightly, that is, the chemical instructions contained in the artificial DNA are modified somewhat. Occasionally, a muted child DNA will create a fitter, that is, more performant blob than its parent. By cycling through this loop many times, a desired artificial DNA is formed, which grows the desired shape or function of its blob. The result is a molecular product that performs some useful function. Self-assembly. However, evolving single components is not enough. These components then need to be complementary in shape so that they can self-assemble, that is, fit together like jigsaw puzzle pieces to form a greater functioning whole. Viruses form this way. Portions of DNA genes code for the construction of viral components. Once they are built, they click together to form whole viruses. So the component parts need to have lock and key shape complementarities. They need to have the capacity to self-assemble simply by bumping into each other, as occurs frequently in the chaotic and high-speed motion at the molecular scale. This notion of self-assembly is very important when it comes to building an asteroid-sized Artilect, or even one of human size. A human-sized Artilect, or a human-sized anything, contains trillions of molecules. To build a human-sized Artilect would require that all the atoms of that Artilect, all trillions of them, be placed with atomic precision at just the right places. Such an Artilect, I believe, would have to build itself through an embryological process. It would have to embryofacture itself. So how would such an Artilect be built and designed in the first place? Initially, the first, very primitive Artilects would need to be built by evolutionary engineers, people like me. Perhaps, well, I'm an evolutionary engineer, but not with biology. I do it with neural nets to make artificial brains. Well, I did, because I've been retired 7 years. Back to the book. Perhaps they should be called embryofacturers or embryological engineers. At first, the evolved 3D molecular structures could be assembled piece by piece into a larger 3D structure. Later, more sophisticated artilects could be built which perform their own evolution, perhaps within their own bodies, and make their own decisions at electronic speeds. Of course, human beings would need to abandon all hope of fully understanding how these evolving Darwinian artilects would develop. Their artilectural structure and functioning would be so complex and change so fast that full human understanding of it all would be totally impractical. Such human ignorance will later prove to be powerful ideological fuel to the Terrans, who will argue that the very nature of Artilect construction, that is Darwinian self-assembling embryo facture, makes Artilect behavior inherently unpredictable and hence potentially very dangerous for human beings. This point will be discussed again at length in Chapter 5, which presents the case of the Terrans. Putting the technologies together. So let me try to summarize a bit here. After all, the point of this chapter has been to introduce these technologies that will enable the construction of Artilects this century. So far, the vision presented in this chapter is that of an Artilect containing 10 to power 40 atoms or bits of information using nanotech-based, self-assembling, embryo-factured, heatless, reversible, three-dimensional computer circuitry, thinking at least 1 million times faster and probably a lot faster than humans. It will contain a huge number of sensors attached to its surface with enormous memory capacities, etc. But there's more. Quantum computing Artilects. These Artilects will be using molecular and atomic-sized components, so these components will be subject to the laws of quantum mechanics. Recently, the new field of quantum computing has become popular as theoretical and experimental physicists compete with each other to dream up new ways to quantum compute and to implement these ideas in real hardware. I hesitate to describe what quantum computing is to the general public. It's very counterintuitive and difficult to grasp. If the following few paragraphs sound like gobbledygook to you, then just flip to the next topic. In a sense, no one really understands quantum theory. It seems like a branch of mathematical recipes that give good numerical answers to problems, but seems totally unintuitive conceptually. Atoms behave in the weirdest ways, quite unlike what human beings are accustomed to at our scale of things. Quantum mechanics is truly weird and abstract. It's a branch of mathematical physics that gives the probabilities of certain measurement results when atomic scale systems interact with human scale measurement devices. In classical mechanics, the state of a physical system is distinct, that is, it has given values. For example, its velocity at a given moment is v, its position is x, its kinetic energy is k, etc. In quantum mechanics, things are more abstract. The state of a quantum system is represented by an abstract mathematical sum of numbers, where each number is associated with a measurement result if a measurement is performed. This summing and linear weighting of states is called a superposition, and is the conceptual heart of quantum mechanics. Don't fret too much if you don't understand this. It's not essential to the understanding of this section. It is this superposition that is the great feature of quantum computing. The superposition evolves over time, in a sense performing many calculations at once, whereas a classical computer can only do one thing at a time. In classical computing, the state of a register, that's a storage chain of bits, is a definite string of zeros and ones. For example, 00110111101001. In a quantum computing register, the state is a superposition of a huge number of possible classical register states. For example, if there are n bits in the register, then there are 2 to the power n possible different classical register states. For example, if n is 3, there are 8 different classical states: 000, 001, 010, 011, 100, 101, 110, 111. If n is large, then 2 to the n is huge. The enormous advantage of quantum computing is that this huge number of classical states gets treated as though it is just one superimposed state, one quantum state that the quantum system can handle. In order to perform a calculation with classical computing, it's often necessary to test each classical register state one at a time for all possible states. This is a slow business, and as n increases, the number of tests rises exponentially. That is, like 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, etc. With quantum computing, however, only one test needs to be done, because in a sense, all possible classical states are blended in together in the quantum register state. Quantum computing is potentially incredibly more efficient than classical computing. It's therefore not surprising that many physicists around the world are now racing each other to see who can build the next most performant quantum computer. Since the Artilect will be built with atomic scale components, it will need to function as a quantum computer. Since quantum computers are more efficient than classical computers, this is a good thing. The Artilect will be a quantum computer. The consequences of an Artilect being a quantum computer are profound. Consider the 2 to the n times greater computing capacity of the quantum computer compared with the classical computer. An asteroid-sized Artilect would have 10 to the power 40 atoms and hence bits. The potential computing capacity of such an Artilect, even a classical computing type Artilect, is hugely larger than that of a human being. My computer is I just have to do it more I have to scroll more slowly, otherwise just coming up blank pages. Okay, so my last sentence is hugely larger than that of a human being. Okay, so I've learned something. For the rest of this book I will scroll more slowly. Okay, back to the book. What then of a quantum computing Artilect? If n is 10 to the power 40, what is 2 to the n? The mind boggles. When I say that an Artilect could potentially have an artificial intelligence of trillions of trillions of trillions of times the human level, I am in fact exaggerating. My numbers are astronomically too small. Admittedly, state-of-the-art quantum computers are handling about 7 components. Qubits, they are called, or quantum bits. It has been... No, that was state-of-the-art in 1998 when I wrote this book. It has been possible to trap 7 atoms in a row, an atom register, in a kind of magnetic bottle, and make them behave as a quantum computer to some extent. Quantum computing technology is still a long way from building a quantum computer with n equals 10 to the power 40. It's still debatable whether such large numbers will ever be possible, but recent error correction techniques, etc., seem to suggest theoretically that quantum computers will become practical and later commercial. If there are no theoretical reasons to suggest that such numbers are impossible, then that usually means that science will eventually find a way to create such machines. Nanotech as a brain science tool. Having said something, probably quite incomprehensible, about quantum computing, I turn now to another important question regarding Artilect technology. The question is this: how human, brain-like, will an Artilect be? My feeling is that as nanotech really comes online, and as Moore's law really bites, our knowledge of how the human brain functions will increase dramatically. For example, over the past decade or so, various non-invasive techniques have been developed to observe the human brain in action without disturbing it in a fundamental way. For example, mildly radioactive oxygen-based fluids can be injected into the bloodstream, which travel to the brain and accumulate where brain cells are more active and need more oxygen and hence more blood. Human subjects are asked to perform various mental tasks, and as they do, the regions of the brain that are used more heavily in performing those tasks show higher concentrations of radioactivity. Brain scientists or neuroscientists are thus able to localize where certain tasks are performed in the brain. Our knowledge of brain function, at least on a macro scale, has jumped considerably in recent years due to these techniques. Ad-libbing now. This is the so-called PET, positron emission tomography. It's been a bit outdated now by something called fMRI, functional magnetic resonance or nuclear magnetic resonance imaging, where you don't have to be injected with radioactive materials. You just put your head in a big magnetic machine and it can read the active areas of the brain. Back to the book. More exotic methods employ phenomena based on nuclear physics, such as nuclear magnetic resonance, NMR, which I won't even attempt to describe here. Nuclear magnetic resonance imaging, NMRI, which got shortened to MRI because the ignorant, stupid general public were frightened by the N, the nuclear, because they associated N with nuclear accidents at nuclear reactors. So the word N has negative connotations to the ignorant masses. Anyway, nuclear magnetic resonance imaging, NMRI, is getting more precise every year as new tricks are found to get finer spatial resolution and shorter measurement times of the human brain regions it observes. As Moore's law provides faster electronics, the spatial and time window resolutions get finer and finer. Some scientists believe that by the year 2020 or thereabouts, it will be possible to observe individual synapses, that's neural connections, and their type, that is, whether they stimulate or inhibit the firing of the neuron they connect to. If this were possible, then neuroengineers could simply scan the brain, that is, just read it off by downloading all the essential geographical information about the brain, for example, the precise position of each neuron and how and where it is connected to which other neurons, etc. All this information could be dumped into a hypercomputer that Moore's law will make possible and then be subject to further analysis by other parts of the same computer. In a sense, one would have a human-like brain inside the hypercomputer. This raises all kinds of moral issues. Can one switch off the hypercomputer containing the human brain dump? Would that be murder? How do you define the essence of personhood? Does it depend on the technological base used to build that person? For example, a carbon and DNA-based technology or a silicon-based technology? If the essential architecture is the same, if the functionality is the same, then should the silicon version of the person be given the same rights as the carbon-based version? Silicon rights? If humans decide that silicon-based brain dumps are non-people, then neuroscientists and neurocomputer scientists can start playing with the data, the person? They will be able